The captain of the Mongol warship felt the current shift beneath his feet. For 3 weeks, his fleet had been retreating down the Bac Dang River, harassed by Vietnamese boats that struck and vanished into the maze of waterways. Now, finally, the open sea was less than 2 miles ahead. But something was wrong. The water was dropping too fast, the tide was pulling out, and the river that had carried 400 warships upstream was becoming a trap. The captain shouted for more oars, more speed. The helmsman screamed back that they were already at full stroke. Then came the sound, a grinding, scraping noise from beneath the hull, wood splintering against something harder than rock. The ship lurched to the left, then stopped dead in the water. All around him, other ships were doing the same. Some tipped sideways. Others drove their bows straight into the mud. Sailors tumbled across decks as vessels collided with whatever was hidden beneath the brown water of the Bac Dang. The captain looked over the rail. The tide had dropped 3 feet in the last 10 minutes, and now he could see them. Iron-tipped wooden stakes, hundreds of them, driven into the riverbed at precise angles. His ship was impaled through the bottom. Water was already flooding the lower deck. And then, from the riverbanks on both sides, came the fire. Vietnamese boats emerged from hidden channels, loaded with burning oil and dry straw. They crashed into the trapped Mongol ships one after another. Within an hour, the largest invasion fleet the Mongol Empire had ever sent against Vietnam was a smoking graveyard of broken timber and drowning men. This was April 9th, 1288. And the man who designed this trap was not a trained military commander. He was a prince who had spent months living among rice farmers, learning the one thing the Mongols never understood: the tide. If you want to see how the most powerful empire on earth was outsmarted by wooden stakes and farming knowledge, subscribe now. Because this story only gets more insane from here. To understand why the Mongols sent 400 warships to Vietnam in the first place, you need to know what happened in the 20 years before this battle. In 1258, the Mongol general Uriyangqadai led the first invasion of Dai Viet, the Vietnamese kingdom. He brought 30,000 cavalry and expected the same rapid conquest his forces had achieved everywhere else. The Mongols had just finished destroying the Song dynasty in China. They had crushed every army that stood against them from Korea to Poland. But Vietnam was different. The terrain was wrong for cavalry. Dense jungles, flooded rice paddies, and rivers that twisted through mountains made the famous Mongol horse archers almost useless. The Vietnamese king, Tran Tai Tong, refused to meet the Mongols in open battle. Instead, his forces melted into the countryside, burned their own crops, and waited. Within 3 months, disease and starvation had killed more Mongol soldiers than combat. Uriyangqadai retreated north with barely half his army intact. The Mongols did not forget this humiliation. In 1285, Kublai Khan sent a second invasion force. This time, he committed 300,000 troops under the command of his son, Togun, and the veteran general, Sogedu. The plan was to overwhelm Vietnam with sheer numbers, take the capital at Thang Long, capture the royal family, end the war in weeks. The Vietnamese commander facing this army was a 57-year-old prince named Tran Hung Dao. He had studied the first invasion carefully. He knew the Mongols could not be beaten in direct combat. Their discipline, their archery, their coordination between units was simply too good, so he refused to give them that fight. Tran Hung Dao evacuated the capital before the Mongols arrived. He moved the population into the mountains and jungles. He ordered every grain storehouse burned, every well poisoned, every boat on the rivers either hidden or destroyed. The Mongols took Thang Long in February 1285. They found an empty city with no food, no supplies, and no enemy to fight. For the next 6 months, Tran Hung Dao's forces conducted hit and run attacks across the country. They ambushed supply convoys. They assassinated officers. They attacked at night and disappeared before dawn. The Mongol army, designed to win wars through decisive battles, had no answer for an enemy that simply refused to exist as a target. By summer, disease had swept through the Mongol camps. Their supply lines from China were stretched thin and under constant attack. Sogetu was killed in an ambush. Togun, the prince, was nearly captured twice. In August 1285, the Mongols retreated for the second time. They had lost over half their army without ever winning a major battle. But Kublai Khan was not finished. In 1287, the Great Khan launched his third and final invasion of Vietnam. This time, he sent everything. 500 warships carrying 100,000 soldiers and sailors. Supply ships loaded with enough rice to feed the army for a year. Artillery, siege equipment, the largest naval force the Mongol Empire had ever assembled. The fleet was commanded by Omar, one of Kublai's most trusted admirals. The land forces were led by Togun again, determined to avenge his earlier failure. Their orders were simple: crush Vietnam completely, leave nothing standing. Tran, Hung Dao, knew this invasion was different. The Mongols had learned from their previous defeats. They brought their own supplies. Their fleet gave them control of the rivers and coastline. They could resupply by sea and strike anywhere they wanted. Direct resistance would mean annihilation. So the prince went to the rice farmers along the Bac Dang River, and he asked them a question that would change history. When does the tide turn? The Bac Dang River was unlike any waterway the Mongols had encountered. It connected the interior of Vietnam to the Gulf of Tonkin, but its tidal range was extreme. At high tide, the river was deep enough for the largest warships. At low tide, it became a shallow channel filled with sandbars and mudflats. The local farmers had worked these waters for generations. They knew exactly when the tide would rise and fall. They knew how fast the water would drain. They knew which channels became impassable at certain hours. Tran Hung Dao asked them to share everything. For weeks, the prince and his officers studied the tidal patterns. They measured depths at different times of day. They mapped the river bottom, and noting where the mud was soft and where the bedrock lay close to the surface. Then Tran Hung Dao gave his orders. Thousands of wooden stakes were cut from iron-hard tropical timber. Each stake was sharpened to a point and tipped with iron. The stakes were between 6 and 12 feet long, designed to reach from the riverbed to just below the waterline at low tide. At high tide, they would be completely invisible. The farmers and soldiers worked at night, driving the stakes into the riverbed in carefully planned patterns. The stakes were angled to catch ships moving downstream. Any vessel that struck them at speed would be impaled through the hull. The trap covered a stretch of river nearly a mile long. But the stakes alone would not be enough. Tran Hung Dao needed to lure the Mongol fleet into the trap at exactly the right moment. If the Mongols entered at low tide, they would see the stakes and avoid them. If they entered too early at high tide, they might pass through before the water dropped. The timing had to be perfect. In late March 1288, Tran Hung Dao put his plan into action. He sent a small fleet of Vietnamese boats upriver to engage the Mongol navy. These boats were not meant to win. They were meant to fight, fall back, and lead the Mongols on a chase. For 3 weeks, the Vietnamese harassed the Mongol fleet. They attacked supply ships. They set fires on anchored vessels at night. They made the Mongol commanders angry and overconfident. On the morning of April 9th, the Vietnamese boats made their final stand near the upper reaches of the Bac Dang River. They engaged the Mongol fleet in what appeared to be a desperate last battle. Then they retreated. The Mongol Admiral Omar saw his chance. The Vietnamese were finally running. Their boats were fleeing downstream toward the sea. If he pursued immediately, he could trap them against the coast and destroy the last of the Vietnamese navy. Omar gave the order to pursue with all speed. 400 Mongol warships poured down the Bac Dang River. The current was with them. The wind was favorable. The Vietnamese boats stayed just ahead, close enough to chase but too fast to catch. The tide was at its peak. For the first 2 miles, the pursuit went perfectly. The Mongol ships gained on the fleeing Vietnamese. Victory seemed certain. Then the tide began to turn. At first, it was barely noticeable. The current slowed. The Vietnamese boats seemed to speed up slightly, but the Mongol helmsmen were focused on the chase, not the water depth. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. The water level dropped 3 feet in less than 15 minutes. Suddenly, ships that had been sailing freely were scraping bottom. Oarsmen who tried to push off felt their oars sink into thick mud rather than solid water. And then the stakes found them. The lead Mongol ships hit the underwater barrier at full speed. Iron-tipped points punched through hulls designed to resist arrows and spears. Ships that tried to turn sideways were caught by stakes at different angles. Vessels that slowed down were rammed by the ships behind them. Within minutes, the entire Mongol fleet was trapped in a mass of tangled rigging, broken oars, and sinking ships. That was when Tran Hung Dao gave the signal. Vietnamese boats, loaded with burning material, emerged from hidden channels along both riverbanks. They had been waiting for hours, their crews watching the tide and the Mongol pursuit. The fireboats crashed into the trapped fleet, flames spread from ship to ship, jumping across tangled masts and oil-soaked decks. Mongol sailors who jumped overboard to escape the fire found themselves in chest-deep mud, easy targets for Vietnamese archers on the banks. The slaughter lasted hours. Omar, the Mongol admiral, was captured alive. So was Togun's son. Hundreds of other officers were killed or taken prisoner. Of the 400 warships that entered the Bac Dang trap, fewer than 20 escaped to the sea. The Mongol land army, learning of the fleet's destruction, began retreating north. Tran Hung Dao's forces pursued them for weeks, and harassing the withdrawal just as they had harassed every Mongol advance. Togun reached China with a fraction of his forces. He never returned to Vietnam. The Battle of Bac Dang was not just a military victory. It was the end of Mongol ambitions in Southeast Asia. Kublai Khan was 73 years old when news of the disaster reached him. He had spent 30 years building the largest empire in human history. His armies had conquered China, Korea, Tibet, and much of Central Asia, but Vietnam had beaten him 3 times. The Great Khan ordered preparations for a 4th invasion. His generals refused. The treasury was empty. The army was exhausted. No one believed that more troops or more ships would change the outcome. Kublai Khan died. 6 years later, the invasion never came. Vietnam remained independent for the next 500 years. The Bac Dang stakes were recovered from the river bottom centuries later. Some of them are still preserved in Vietnamese museums. They are simple wooden poles, sharpened and tipped with iron. Farming tools, really, the kind of thing any peasant could make. But in the hands of a commander who understood his terrain, who listened to farmers instead of ignoring them, those stakes destroyed an empire's greatest fleet. Tran Hung Dao became a national hero in Vietnam. Temples were built in his honor. His writings on guerrilla warfare were studied for generations. When the Vietnamese faced later invasions, first by the Chinese and then by the French and Americans, they remembered his lessons. Never fight on the enemy's terms. Use the land. Use the water. Use time itself as a weapon. The Mongols never understood why they lost at Bac Dang. Their records describe the defeat as bad luck, as trickery, as something dishonorable. They could not accept that their superior numbers, their better ships, their more experienced sailors had been beaten by stakes in the mud. But that was exactly what happened. 200 farmers who knew their river had defeated the largest navy the Mongol Empire ever built. If this story surprised you, you should know that Vietnamese military history is full of moments like this. Battles where inferior forces used terrain, timing, and local knowledge to destroy much larger armies. I cover these battles every week on this channel, so if you want to see more, hit subscribe and I will see you in the next one.